Hey, it is exactly 12 noon here in Eastern Standard Time. And I have a little bit of an introduction here, which I will do before introducing our speaker. But I am very excited today, and thank you for joining in 1 week later than intended to listen to Dr. Jennifer Rabin talk about earlier menopause and the brain health. What's the link? Now, before we start, I want to acknowledge that we live work and play and participate in a community on the unceded, ceded, and traditional territories of 630 First Nations, each of which possesses their own unique traditions and history here on this land that we now refer to as Canada. Recognizing that not all of us are joining from Canada, we acknowledge the importance of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's call to action and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In all of our work, we're committed to ensuring Indigenous women's rights to health and safety and the equal opportunity to participate in a manner that recognizes and respects Indigenous cultures and traditions. Today, myself, I'm joining you from Toronto, which is covered by Toronto Purchase number 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Toronto is now home to a vast diversity of First Nations, Inuit, Métis who enrich the city. Many of our members also live in Vancouver, which is part of the unceded traditional and homelands of the Coast Salish peoples of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I encourage all of you, no matter where you live in the world, to learn about the Indigenous cultures on the lands of which you dwell. And you can always add that into the chat. So this is brought to you by the Women's Health Research Cluster. We established ourselves in 2018, believe it or not. And we have over 800 members and across 32 countries. We host a number of events. The next one is a trainee research presentation series, also on menopause. So if you're interested in this, please check it out. We also have some trainees from the Rabin lab that will be giving talks in that seminar series, as well as a trainee from my own lab, maybe. I'm not even sure about that. But we have a number of other events as well. We do quite a bit of outreach, so there's a blog. Please, if you have any ideas for the blog or even podcast, please do reach out to us. That will be reimagined very soon. And obviously, we thank all of the people, our collaborations and people that support our research. And one last thing, we have these trainee travel awards, and please do think about participating in that if you have some women's health or SGBA work that you're presenting, because it's really important to keep singing that song when we are facing some political winds that are wanting to, let's say, silence perhaps women's health research. We can't let that happen because there's so little of it anyway. Now, I want to read out Dr. Rabin's bio. Dr. Jennifer Rabin is a registered neuropsychologist and an assistant professor in neurology at the University of Toronto, and a scientist at Sunnybrook Research Institute. A major focus of Dr. Rabin's work is on women's health and sex differences in two primary areas: neuromodulation and depression, and Alzheimer's disease risk factors, which she'll be talking about today. Dr. Rabin holds multiple external grants from CIHR, which is a major federal funding agency here in Canada, as well as NSERC, another major one in Canada, the Alzheimer's Society, and the Alzheimer's Association. Her contributions to the field have been recognized with several awards, including the Human Amyloid Imaging Young Investigator Award, the Department of Medicine Junior Investigator Award, and the Rising Star designation at the Association for Psychological Science. Now, I always ask people for their fun facts, and Jenny's fun fact will not disappoint you. She not only has a twin sister, who's also in academia, who I believe is at McGill, which is in Montreal, Canada. If she wasn't a neuropsychologist, and neuropsychologists are amazing people, just in case you don't know any yet, she would be a private detective. And I want to learn more about that. And I think in her science, we're probably all private detectives. But with that, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rabin.
Thank you, Lisa. That was a fun introduction. I like the fun facts. All right, so today I'm going to speak about earlier menopause and brain health. What's the link? Can you see my slides okay? Okay, great. All right, so I wanted to start today by just clarifying some terminology to make sure we're all on the same page. I know not everybody here has a background in dementia. So for those of you who don't know, dementia is an overarching or umbrella term used to describe a decline in thinking abilities that's severe enough to interfere with daily activities. So things like cooking, managing medications, driving, dressing, etc. And dementia is a syndrome, meaning that it refers to a set of symptoms and says nothing about what's causing the decline in cognition. Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia, which likely explains why the two terms are often used interchangeably. However, this is incorrect. As I just mentioned, dementia is a broader term that refers to cognitive decline that interferes with day-to-day activities, whereas Alzheimer's disease is just one of the many causes of dementia. Vascular pathology or damage to the brain's blood vessels is another common cause of dementia. And this damage can result from a stroke or a series of small strokes. It can also result from chronic conditions like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, and obesity. Dementia can also be caused by Lewy body pathology, which involves abnormal deposits of the protein alpha-synuclein in the brain. And these deposits are a hallmark of Lewy body dementia and Parkinson's disease dementia. And I'll be talking about this later in my talk. And of course, there's many other causes of dementia. I can't mention all of them here, but just to be aware that it extends beyond these three. And in most cases, dementia is not caused by a single pathology, but rather a mix of different brain pathologies. In fact, mixed pathologies are the norm rather than the exception. So common combinations include Alzheimer's disease and vascular pathology, as well as Alzheimer's disease and Lewy body pathology. And this is going to become clear throughout my talk. So let's start by talking about Alzheimer's disease in more detail. Alzheimer's disease is defined by the presence of amyloid plaques and tau neurofibrillary tangles. And you can see those plaques and tangles here in the brain of a patient who passed away with Alzheimer's disease. And while there's still debate about the exact cause of Alzheimer's disease, most researchers agree that the disease follows a relatively predictable pattern of progression. So the earliest event in this process is the accumulation of amyloid plaques in the brain. And we now know that these plaques begin to form at least 20 years before clinical symptoms appear. These plaques then lead to the spreading of tau, and tau, again, is that second hallmark pathology of Alzheimer's disease. And we know that tau is highly toxic to brain cells. And as tau spreads throughout the brain, it causes neurons to die or brain cells to die, leading to tissue loss throughout the brain. This tissue loss results in cognitive decline and ultimately results in dementia. Again, that syndrome where individuals have trouble taking care of themselves because of severe cognitive impairment. And I think as many of us here know, women have a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease dementia compared to men. In fact, nearly 2/3 of individuals living with Alzheimer's disease dementia are women. The reasons behind this disparity are not fully understood. And while women live longer than men, longevity alone does not fully explain this difference. And one emerging hypothesis that I'm going to focus on today is menopause. So does menopause play a role in this increased risk? So as many of us know, menopause is a natural biological process that marks the end of menstrual cycles. It typically occurs around age 51, although this can vary, happening earlier or later for some individuals. During menopause, the ovaries significantly reduce hormone production, leading to a decline in estradiol, the most potent form of estrogen, among other changes in ovarian hormones. But why does this matter for brain health? Many people don't realize that the brain is an endocrine organ, meaning that it's deeply influenced by sex hormones, especially estradiol. So the image here illustrates the brain's extensive network of estrogen receptors, highlighting the close connection between estradiol and the brain. And you can see that we have estrogen receptors in really key areas of the brain that are important for cognition, and also implicated in Alzheimer's disease, so the prefrontal cortex as well as the hippocampus. And estradiol has multiple beneficial effects in the brain. It's involved in synapse formation, it promotes neurogenesis, reduces inflammation, improves blood flow, enhances glucose transport into the brain, and also protects against mitochondrial damage. And the decline in estradiol during menopause can disrupt these processes, potentially making the brain more susceptible to other damage and insults. So this blue box here represents the period during and after menopause. But menopause isn't the only major change that occurs during this life stage. So earlier I mentioned that Alzheimer's disease pathology begins accumulating approximately 20 years before clinical symptoms appear. And in most cases, Alzheimer's disease symptoms typically emerge in a person's early 70s or later, and that timeline takes us right back to menopause. We go 20 years before that. And so this raises an important question of whether menopause-related changes might contribute to the development of Alzheimer's disease pathology. Now, one important catch is that all women or females experience menopause, but of course, more women than not, most women do not get Alzheimer's disease dementia. So this means that menopause alone is not the deciding factor. And there must be other factors that tip the scale. And one aspect I've become quite interested in is the timing of menopause, and particularly earlier menopause, and how that might increase dementia risk. So in this study here that was published in 2024, researchers looked at data from over 200,000 women in order to understand how age at menopause influences dementia risk. The authors found that women who entered menopause before the age of 40 had the highest risk of dementia. And in fact, this risk was on par with the risk associated with smoking or having a previous stroke. This risk was still elevated for those who experienced menopause between the ages of 40 and 44, and even those between the ages of 45 and 49. And I should mention that in this study, the risk was the same whether menopause occurred spontaneously or was due to a hysterectomy or oophorectomy. And importantly, this finding has been replicated in multiple other studies, reinforcing the link between earlier age of menopause and higher risk of dementia. And so in this talk, I really wanted to try to understand how earlier menopause is increasing dementia risk. And I don't think it's that earlier menopause just moves the clock forward or speeds up aging. I think it fundamentally changes how key aspects of brain health unfold. And today I want to focus on three major factors that might shape cognitive aging and dementia risk in the setting of earlier menopause. And so the first one I'm going to focus on today is synaptic health. So the first study I'll talk about was led by Madeline Wood, a PhD student in my lab, and this work was done in collaboration with Caitlin Casaletto at UCSF. And this work was published just last week in Science Advances if you want to learn more. So when I talk about synaptic functioning or synaptic health, what do I mean? So let's go back to Biology 101, where we first learned about synapses. So as you might recall, a synapse is a small gap between neurons where communication occurs. These connections are vital for brain health and for brain function. And I think what makes synapses truly remarkable is their plasticity, their ability to change and adapt. And with repeated use, a synapse strengthens, enhancing its influence on neighboring neurons. And this process is really the foundation of how we learn, form memories, and adapt to new experiences. And research shows that disruptions in synaptic integrity and functioning can contribute to the accumulation of amyloid and tau in the brain, those two key hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. And it can also contribute to cognitive difficulties and cognitive decline. And so in this first study, we wanted to examine how age at menopause influences these associations, and specifically whether earlier menopause amplifies the effects of poor synaptic health on these two outcomes. So in this study, we focused on 3 synaptic proteins, complexin-1, which is inhibitory, complexin-2, which is excitatory, and then the interactions between snare protein-protein complexes, which get at the functionality of snare proteins. So participants in this study were recruited from Russia's Memory and Aging Program, which enrolls individuals without known dementia and then follows them throughout their lifetime and assesses cognition annually. And then upon their passing, an autopsy is confirmed. And in this study, there were 268 participants. The mean age at baseline was just under 84. Age at death was close to 91. I just want to point out that it's a predominantly white sample with the age at menopause just over 50 years old, at the age of 50. So the first question we focused on was, does earlier age at menopause influence the association between reduced synaptic health and Alzheimer's pathology? So we found that earlier age at menopause strengthened the relationship between synaptic markers and tau tangles, just as we had expected. And this effect was evident for complexin-1, as you can see here, and then the snare interaction. So I'm going to walk you through these plots. So on the x-axis here, I have synaptic health, where higher values indicate better synaptic health. And then the y-axis is our tau tangles, where higher values indicate more tau pathology. The red line represents estimates of those with earlier menopause, and the blue line represents those with later menopause. So for individuals with later menopause, as you can see, those in the blue line, there was little to no association between synaptic markers and tau tangles, as you can see here. However, for those with earlier menopause, as shown in the red line, we can see a stronger relationship whereby lower synaptic health is associated with more tangle pathology. Now, this moderation was not significant for complexin-2. And we also found that the moderation of age at menopause on the association between synaptic markers was not significant for amyloid, suggesting that the effect is specific to tau. Okay, so I just showed you that earlier age at menopause strengthened the association between reduced synaptic health and greater tau pathology. And next, we wanted to examine whether age at menopause moderated the influence of synaptic health on cognitive decline. So again, as we expected, we found that earlier age at menopause strengthened the associations between synaptic markers and cognitive decline. So this time I have time on the x-axis and global cognition on the y-axis. And then I'm stratifying the sample by those with earlier menopause and those with later menopause for the 3 proteins that we looked at. And then these different colored lines here represent levels of synaptic dysfunction or synaptic health. So the red line indicates the greatest synaptic dysfunction, the blue line, moderate dysfunction, and the green line, the least dysfunction or the healthiest synaptic function. So let's first focus on individuals with later menopause. We see that cognition declines over time in these individuals. However, this decline does not vary based on the level of synaptic health. You can see these lines overlap with one another. However, we see a very different pattern for those with earlier menopause. As you can see, individuals with earlier menopause and worse synaptic health experience the fastest cognitive decline, as shown by these red lines here. However, those with earlier menopause but good synaptic health decline at a much slower rate, as shown by these green lines here. So this suggests that it's not just the timing of menopause that matters, but also the state of synaptic health, which can either accelerate cognitive decline if it's poor or serve as a key resilience factor against cognitive decline if our synaptic health is built up. So the last thing we wanted to look at in this study was how menopausal hormone therapy influences these relationships. And we found that in women with lower synaptic health or poorer synaptic health, menopausal hormone therapy helped reduce the negative effects of earlier menopause on both tau pathology and cognitive decline. So specifically, it weakened the link between earlier menopause and both increased tau and faster cognitive decline. So here we can see that hormone therapy is having a protective effect, helping to slow down brain and cognitive changes that could lead to dementia. Okay, so next I want to move on to speaking about vascular health. So we've known for a long time that poor vascular health is associated with cognitive decline and progression to Alzheimer's disease dementia. The brain relies on a steady supply of blood from the heart to function properly. And when this blood flow gets disrupted, brain cells can become damaged. And we know that this disruption can be caused by factors like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, smoking, and physical inactivity. So really whatever is bad for the heart is also bad for the brain. And earlier we talked about the menopause transition, and we talked about how this is a period when Alzheimer's disease pathology begins to accumulate. And we also know that the menopause transition impacts vascular health. So the loss of estradiol negatively influences blood pressure, cholesterol, insulin resistance, which is important in diabetes, and weight. And again, all of these risk factors are not only risk factors for cardiovascular disease, but are also risk factors for cognitive decline and dementia. And some of my work that I'm not going to talk about today has shown strong links between poor vascular health and increased Alzheimer's pathology, specifically tau, which is the more toxic Alzheimer's protein. So this brings us to the question we wanted to ask in this next study, and that's whether does age at menopause moderate the association between cardiovascular health and brain structure, as well as cognitive decline. And specifically, the question we wanted to ask was, does earlier age at menopause strengthen the associations between poor vascular health and reduced brain structure, as well as faster cognitive decline? So let's start by focusing on cognitive decline. To address this question, we used data from the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, which provided access to nearly 9,000 postmenopausal women. And we used a summary score to quantify cardiovascular health that included the presence or absence of various vascular conditions, along with smoking status. So participants just got a tally score of these factors here. And then cognitive decline was measured at baseline, and then 3 years later with the tests I listed here. So we created a composite score that got at global cognition. And this work that I'm going to present was also led by Madeline Wood Alexander. So we found that age at menopause moderated the association between cardiovascular health and cognitive decline, such that earlier age at menopause strengthened the association between worse cardiovascular health and faster cognitive decline. So let me walk you through this plot. On the x-axis, we have cardiovascular health, where higher scores represent worse cardiovascular health. And then the y-axis, I have cognition at follow-up, which has been adjusted for baseline scores. So lower scores here represent faster cognitive decline or worse cognition. And then the different lines here represent model estimates for women who experienced earlier menopause, average menopause, and later menopause. And you can see that for women with later menopause, there's no association between cardiovascular health and cognition. The line is flat, meaning that cardiovascular health does not impact cognition in women who experience menopause later than the average age. However, you can see that those who have earlier menopause, we see that they're much more susceptible to the negative effects of worse cardiovascular health. Here we see a very steep line, suggesting that those with worse cardiovascular health have worse cognition at follow-up. Next, we examine whether menopausal hormone therapy influenced these relationships. And we found that menopause hormone therapy attenuated this association, meaning that it had a protective effect. And all women in this study who took hormone therapy took it within 5 years of menopause. So for those without a history of hormone therapy, shown in this red line, you can see that there was a strong association such that earlier menopause was linked to worse cognition at follow-up. However, for those with a history of hormone therapy, the decline was less steep. You can see that at earlier ages of menopause, cognition was relatively better than those who did not take hormone therapy, suggesting that hormone therapy offered some protection against decline. All right, so we showed that reduced cardiovascular health was associated with worse cognition in the context of earlier menopause. And so next we wanted to ask the question whether age at menopause also moderates the association between cardiovascular health and brain structure. So to address this question, we used data from a cohort of Canadian women who participated in the Ontario Health Study, and then were later recruited to a different study called the Canadian Alliance for Healthy Hearts and Minds. And this allowed us to combine data on reproductive history collected in the Ontario Health Study with imaging data collected in the Canadian Alliance for Healthy Hearts and Minds data. And so this resulted in a sample size of 700 postmenopausal women. So this time we looked at a different measure of cardiovascular health. So this time cardiovascular health was assessed with ejection fraction, and it was measured with MRI. And for those of you who don't know, ejection fraction indicates the percentage of blood the left ventricle pumps out with each contraction, whereas a higher percentage typically indicates better cardiac function. And then in terms of brain structure, we looked at two different metrics. So we looked at gray matter volume, shown here, which is a measure of atrophy, and also white matter hyperintensities, which is a measure of small vessel disease. And this work was carried out by Talon Splinter, a first-year master's student in the lab. All right, so the first plot I'm going to show you focused on gray matter volume. Okay, so let me walk you through this plot. So on the x-axis here, I have ejection fraction. The y-axis, I have gray matter volume. The red line, earlier menopause, and the blue line, later menopause. So we found that earlier age at menopause strengthened the association between cardiovascular health and gray matter volume. So you can see that in those with later menopause, again, we don't really see a strong relationship between cardiac health or cardiovascular health and gray matter volume. But in contrast, we see a really strong relationship in those with earlier menopause, whereas those with lower ejection fraction or worse cardiac health or cardiovascular health had lower gray matter volume or more atrophy in their brain. And then we ran something called floodlight analyses, which allow us to identify the age of menopause where this effect becomes most pronounced. And we found that this effect was most pronounced in women who experienced menopause before the age of 49. All right, so the next thing we wanted to look at was white matter hyperintensity burden, again, a measure of small vessel disease. And here we found that earlier age at menopause, again, strengthened the association between cardiovascular health and brain, a measure of brain structure, this time white matter hyperintensity burden. So the plot's the same, but this time I have white matter hyperintensity burden on the y-axis, and this time having higher scores is worse. And again, we don't really see a strong relationship for those with later menopause. But again, we do see a stronger relationship for those with earlier menopause, where those with lower ejection fraction or worse cardiac health had more white matter hyperintensities in their brain. And when we ran a floodlight analysis for white matter hyperintensities, we found that this effect was most pronounced in women who experienced menopause before the age of 45. So together, these findings suggest that an earlier age at menopause strengthened the association between worse cardiac health with poorer brain structure, as well as faster cognitive decline. So the last part of the talk will focus on Lewy body disease. And again, this was led by Madeline Wood and done in collaboration with Caitlin Casaletto. Now, I know we tend to focus a lot on Alzheimer's disease, which is more common in women. However, we tend not to speak a lot about disorders that are more prevalent in men. And Lewy body dementia actually tends to be more common in men. So you can see that here. It's not, the difference isn't as striking as we see with Alzheimer's disease in women, but there is this slight propensity to see Lewy body disease and Lewy body dementia to be more common in men. So what is Lewy body dementia? So it's caused by Lewy bodies, which are these things here, and they're made of alpha-synuclein that tend to aggregate into Lewy bodies within the neurons. And these aggregates disrupt neural function and ultimately lead to cell death. And I think one of the most famous cases of Lewy body dementia is in Robin Williams. So he passed away a few years ago with Lewy body dementia. And as I mentioned earlier, Alzheimer's disease and Lewy body pathologies tend to co-occur. And so in this last study that I'm going to talk about, we wanted to ask how biological sex and earlier age at menopause influences the co-occurrence of Lewy body and Alzheimer's disease pathologies. So to address this question, we used data from the Rush studies. So this included the religious order study, the memory and aging program, and the minority aging research study. So these are all run out of Rush University, and they all have the same protocols, allowing us to combine across these 3 different studies. And then we also looked at data from the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Centers. So to ensure our findings were robust, we ran separate analyses in both data sets. And what we found was that the results were largely the same across the 2 data sets. And just for simplicity, I'm going to focus on results only from Ross, MAP, and Mars. But the key takeaway is that the effects were consistent across both cohorts. So the first thing we found was that women were less likely to have Lewy body pathology compared to men. And so this is consistent with prior research. So you can see here that the probability of having Lewy body pathology is higher in men compared to women. And then we also found that women had greater Alzheimer's pathology compared to men. So again, this was consistent with prior reports. So just some good sanity checks here. So we really wanted to know what happens when we look at the sex-specific associations between Lewy body pathology and Alzheimer's pathology. So we found that Lewy body pathology was more strongly associated with tau in women compared to men. So on the x-axis, we have Lewy body pathology status. So either it was absent or it was present. So that's just how this pathology was classified in our study. And on the x-axis, we have tau tangles. So higher scores represent more tau in the brain. So in individuals without Lewy body pathology in the brain, we found that there was no difference in tau levels between men and women. So you can see women in the pink and men in the blue, and there's not really much difference between the level of tau. However, in individuals with Lewy body pathology in the brain, we found that women showed significantly greater tau pathology than men. So you can see that here. And then in addition, we also found that women with Lewy body pathology had more tau pathology compared to women who did not have Lewy body pathology in the brain. Now, interestingly, when we looked at amyloid plaque burden, we didn't see the same sex-specific associations. So you can see that there was no difference in the level of amyloid in those who did not have Lewy body pathology in the brain. And again, the same thing in those who did have Lewy body pathology in the brain. So this suggests that the effect is really specific to tau, which is something that keeps kind of popping up in the literature, that women seem to be more prone to tau and potentially also more susceptible to tau, and less so to amyloid, although there are some studies showing that women have more amyloid in the brain compared to men. So in women, the presence of Lewy body pathology is associated with more tau. And then next, we wanted to examine whether the age at menopause influenced this association. And our goal was to try to get at whether estrogen-related factors might be responsible for these effects. And that's exactly what we found. We found that earlier age at menopause strengthened the association of Lewy body pathology with tau. So here I'm showing you data from those with earlier menopause before the age of 48. And you can see those who have Lewy body pathology in the brain show greater levels of tau compared to those who don't have Lewy body pathology in the brain. And then here are the data from individuals with average age at menopause. So you can see that there's still a difference in tau pathology, although it's less pronounced compared to those with earlier menopause. And then finally, in those with later menopause, there is no observed difference in tau pathology, suggesting potentially that prolonged estrogen exposure might help mitigate tau accumulation. So just to reiterate, we found that earlier age at menopause moderated the association between the presence of Lewy body pathology and greater tau pathology. And so next, we wanted to look at whether age at menopause moderated the association between Lewy body pathology and cognitive decline. And as you might expect me to say, we did in fact find that earlier age at menopause strengthened the association between Lewy body pathology and memory decline. So let me walk you through this plot. This time I have time in years on the x-axis. And if you remember, the individuals in the Rush cohorts have been, well, maybe actually I didn't talk about this, but they've been followed for up to 30 years. So we have up to 30 years of data on them. And then in individuals, you can see that in, so that's the x-axis, and then the y-axis is memory scores. So these are standardized scores. Higher scores represent better memory, lower scores, worse memory. And then here I'm representing different ages at menopause, earlier menopause in red and later menopause in green. So you can see that in individuals without Lewy body pathology in the brain, age at menopause did not significantly impact memory decline. So again, we see overlap in these lines, these estimates of age at menopause. However, in those with Lewy body pathology in the brain, we see that age at menopause matters, with individuals experiencing earlier menopause showing the fastest memory decline, as represented in this red line here. Or to say it another way, those who had later menopause showed less steep decline in their memory over time. So this suggests that earlier estrogen loss may heighten the brain's susceptibility to Lewy body pathology related memory decline. So just to summarize the findings from this study, we found that an earlier age at menopause moderated the relationship between Lewy body pathology and increased tau pathology, and also Lewy body pathology and faster cognitive decline. So this suggests that earlier estrogen loss may heighten the brain's susceptibility to Lewy body related tau accumulation and cognitive decline. Okay, so now I'm going to move just into a general summary where I talk about how all of these findings kind of fit together. So in the setting of earlier menopause, we found that reduced synaptic health and the presence of Lewy body pathology was associated with more tau in the brain. Again, this very toxic Alzheimer's pathology protein. We found that poor vascular health was linked to reduced brain structure integrity, including gray matter volume, so more atrophy in the brain, and also more evidence of small vessel disease as represented by white matter hyperintensities. And also we found that reduced synaptic health, the presence of Lewy body pathology, and worse cardiovascular health were all associated with faster cognitive decline, again, in the setting of earlier menopause. And lately I've been thinking a lot about, what is it about earlier menopause that makes the brain more susceptible, and really what's going on. And I really think that earlier menopause isn't just about moving the timeline forward. It's not accelerated aging or aging happening at a faster pace. It's really changing the trajectory of brain health. So if we think of the brain as a scale balanced between two forces, where on the one side we have increased risk of dementia And then on the other side, we have being protected against dementia. I think earlier menopause is like adding extra weights to the risk side, where it increases our risk of dementia. So it's not just shifting the timeline, it's just tilting the balance itself, which in turn may make the brain more susceptible to additional insults. So it might make the brain more susceptible to reduced synaptic health, to tau pathology, to vascular brain changes, and also the presence of Lewy body pathology, and likely other things. This is just what I looked at, or we looked at in this study, in the studies I presented today. So how can we tip the scale back in favor of being protected against dementia? Well, one potential is menopause hormone therapy, and we did see beneficial effects in the context of some of our studies. And we know that especially when women take or females take hormone therapy within 5 years of menopause, and potentially when it's even delivered transdermally, it could have very beneficial effects to the brain. But we need more research on this. Another potential area where I think we could kind of tilt the scale back the other way is physical activity. So we know that physical activity can improve the vasculature of the brain, improve synaptic health, and improve our cardiovascular health in general. And the other thing I wanted to bring up was smoking, because we know that smoking has been shown to result in an earlier age of menopause, around 1 to 2 years. And we also know that smoking is toxic to the brain. So potentially helping women, females quit smoking, or preventing individuals from smoking altogether could have a large impact on brain health. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was just improving heart health in general. So again, we've known how to treat vascular health for a really long time. We know how to treat high blood pressure, high cholesterol, obesity, and diabetes. And I think taking advantage of all of these treatments and interventions, we can we can target our heart health, and then in turn improve our brain health. But I think there's likely many more options, and that's why we need to do more research in this area. And I don't think I need to harp on this point to this audience. I think we've all bought in, right? And there's Lisa nodding her head. And so with that, I just wanted to thank my lab, who has done a ton of this work and who makes coming to work every day really fun. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to my funding sources, and then thank you all for your attention, and happy to take questions.
Well, yay, what a tour de force. Thank you very much. It's always hard to give these virtual talks, so please, yes, give your little emojis. I see a number of claps, which is really, really fantastic. So thank you very much. And there's already a couple of questions in the chat. They're pretty much the similar questions. And I have a bunch of questions too, but I can talk to Dr. Rabin anytime. So, but first, I think there's some questions about like when particularly in the studies that you talked about, when are you talking about? Are you talking about like during perimenopause, right at like
Oh, yeah.
when was cognition examined?
Excellent question. And I apologize for not making that clear. So in all of the studies, cognition was assessed many years after menopause. So depending on the sample, the age differed somewhat, anywhere between an average age of 70 to 80, I would say.
Mhm.
And then, of course, all the pathology came at death, which in the Rush sample was on average at age 90.
Right. So you're not talking about perimenopause at that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a very important distinction. So we're just
Um,
looking at how these midlife factors relate to later life cognition, dementia, pathology.
okay. Oh, you guys are so good. Often I'm the one that has to come up, but I want to ask my questions too. Okay. This is a very good question. Is there a link between so, and first of all, I just
Don't
want to
ask me a
say
question I can't answer.
I have a few of those, but you've got to preach. So one thing I probably didn't do well enough at the beginning is, women's health research, we don't have enough of it. We know that already, and it's a little bit under attack in terms of is it really that important? But I think your research is showing that actually it's quite important. obviously quite different. There's a reason why we really do need to use sex as a factor in our analyses and not just look at sex, but look within sex. So earlier age of menopause. I think you can at least partially address this one, which is there a link between more severe perimenopausal symptoms and an earlier onset?
I don't know. An earlier onset. I don't know. Maybe people here can answer that question better. I have to admit that this is a relatively new area for me. I come more from the brain health, so maybe Lisa knows the answer to that question. But what I can say is we actually need better data in terms of menopausal symptoms and later life cognition, dementia, pathology. We don't know the answer to that question because we don't have the data.
What's so interesting, no, 100%. And what's so interesting is there is a little bit of work on like, more severe symptoms and, probably not age of menopause, although it's probably out there, but I was thinking about, brain health in particular. Um, but the straw guidelines, which for people on the call that won't know, that was always the gold standard, or it still is the gold standard for studying menopause. But do you know, like they don't actually even ask, they don't ask about the symptoms. It's all about hormone levels. It's nothing about vasomotor symptoms or any other symptoms and it's not just perimenopause, also menopause. So I think that's shockingly terrible.
Yeah, I agree. There is some data on an association between vasomotor symptoms and white matter
Right.
hyperintensities.
Yeah.
But I think that's maybe all we have. But I think that's pointing into a very important direction.
Mhm.
And we know that white matter hyperintensities are related to Alzheimer's disease pathology in some studies.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so I just think it just kind of reinforces the fact that we need to look at these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Ingrid asks, we know that exercise and activity particular and strength training improves health in all areas. Do you have some suggestions for citing great new literature to support the importance of strength training and improving brain and body health during menopause transition? And oh my gosh, I have an answer for this if you.
Okay, good, please. I
No,
defer
no,
to you.
you go first. You
No,
go
I
first.
don't. I don't know.
You probably do. But Teresa Louis Ambrose, do you know her? She's a physical therapist at University of British Columbia. She does work in this area. She has some work, and we have been trying to get a grant on this for the last 5 years. And CIHR, which is a major granting agency in Canada, just doesn't seem to want to fund it. But it's really, really needed. But we do know that strength training in general is important. So it's likely to play a role, but we need the studies to definitively show that. Um, Quitting smoking at any age is beneficial. This is from Tina. However, at what age prior to menopause do we see the best results? I know the answer to this already, but yes.
Okay. I'm going to defer to Lisa again. I mean, these are all excellent questions.
Oh, my answer would be like we need more research. So that's what.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I thought you maybe knew something I didn't know.
Um, no, 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 no. Another question is when should somebody start hormonal therapy?
Wow. That's what are we talking about? People with symptoms, with no symptoms?
And do we know the answer to that anyway,
Yeah.
regardless? Yeah. The issue is, I think I think you would be shocked for the members of the public at how little research there is on these types of questions. Um, and so that's why we need to, maintain the push for more work in this particular area. Um, I was thinking when you were talking about the healthy cell bias, do you know what so the idea that and this was Roberta Brinton who first brought this up, that hormone therapy in the case that she was arguing was going to be beneficial to a healthy brain, but not necessarily beneficial for an unhealthy brain. And do you think some of your data also sort of supports that idea that, if you already have the beginnings of Lewy body yeah, Lewy body pathology or tau pathology, does that make things worse if you have an earlier age of menopause? If that's even possible, because it's pretty early, right? You're talking.
Yeah. I mean, I would think so, but again, yeah. So as I mentioned, Alzheimer's pathology begins developing years before people have symptoms, so likely around the menopause transition, but it could be later as well. And we don't have that data either, but my suspicion is yes,
Mhm.
that would, I think it would accelerate things in a bad way.
Um, actually, Eshkang, actually, I don't know what the name is there. I have something very similar. I was also thinking about like, so is age and menopause, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, and I don't know just, but do you think it's also a proxy for something else? Like, is
Yeah.
that, disruptions in menstrual cycle, PCOS, endometriosis? Do we know? Do we have a lot of data around that?
I don't know. I thought a lot about, I've been thinking a lot about this because as we accumulate all of these data points showing how earlier age of menopause is kind of worse for the brain, like, well, why? And again, it's not, I don't think it's just shifting things earlier. So it has to be a different explanation. And yeah, I think it's maybe something upstream that maybe kind of ties all these things together. Now, what that is, I don't really know. Like potentially genetics plays a role, and I know I didn't really talk much about ApoE4, which is very important. But I don't think that explains everything here. I don't know. I do think it's not just earlier age at menopause. I think it's more what it represents and what that is. I don't think we really know the answer to that yet, but that's kind of where I'm hoping to go. Just
And
not sure how long it will take me to get there.
good, good, good. Keep going. We need to and in terms of hormone therapy, um, do you because of course, like even in that Science Advances, it was a special issue, I think, right? And there was Rachel Buckley. I don't, I think there was a
Yeah.
news article in the Times or something, right? Your
Yeah.
paper and then Rachel Buckley showing something slightly different between hormone therapy. So do you have any way that you can reconcile? Like, is it good? Is it bad? Does it depend on all sorts of factors?
Yes. Well, I think one of the problems is that we have really poor data. So, even though we showed beneficial effects in some of our studies, Gillian Coughlin and Rachel Buckley showed that it had a negative effect, particularly on increased tau pathology over time in women who had a history of taking hormone therapy, only if they were older. So, not older at the time of taking hormone therapy, but older at the time tau was quantified. But the problem with observational data is that we don't know why women took the hormone therapy in the first place. So maybe in Jillian's study, for example, where she showed an association between hormone therapy and tau pathology, it's not the hormone therapy that was related to the increased tau pathology, but maybe it was the vasomotor symptoms that
Mhm,
somehow relates to tau pathology. And I could think of multiple
mhm,
pathways where that could happen.
mhm.
So now we're saying that it's hormone therapy, but it's really the reason why the individuals took the hormone therapy in the first place. And I think that's the danger in these observational studies, and they have to be done very, very carefully with propensity matching, matching the two groups on vasomotor symptoms and all other characteristics that we know can influence dementia risk to really understand the effects of hormone therapy on brain health.
I would
Um,
add one more thing, which I think
yeah,
you agree with, which is um, that we use terms like hormone therapy, but there are many kinds, and you alluded to, transdermal. So, and somebody's asking about combination, combined, and of course, the progestin matter,
yeah,
I and that, yeah. So, and,
yeah.
and that is, you go ahead.
No, I mean, I agree. And unfortunately, a lot of the data sets that we have access to don't have that level of specificity. So then we end up combining everyone into one group, and maybe,
Yeah.
certain types or administration routes are better than others. And then,
Mhm.
yeah, it just kind of provides a very messy picture. And, I was just going back through some of our data in the study, in Talon's study, to see, oh, how does hormone therapy impact the results? And I saw that actually 40% of women were on hormone therapy, which didn't seem right to me. And so,
Yeah.
are people who maybe were on oral contraceptives responding yes to that question? Like, and we just don't know. So then,
Mhm.
uh,
Oh, and I
yeah,
think
we
that's
just need better
another.
data.
Yeah, I think that's a really another really important point because people will say, oh, well, artificial intelligence is going to be a game changer. We have all these huge databases. It's going to help. But when we don't have the information in the databases, it makes it really hard to address these questions. And I'll just say when we first started with the ADNI database, which is another one, we wanted to look at hormone therapy and the different kinds of hormone therapy and how and it just for the audience, yes, it had a hormone therapy column, but it just said it was hormones or not. So had nothing to do with the type of hormones, at least in that one. Um, so uh, Bill Honer, of course, hello, Dr. Honer, asked about age of menarche and number of children. Is there any? We have a paper coming out together on
And
number of children.
Yeah, I should also mention that Dr. Honer was very instrumental in the synaptic health study. So thank you for all your help there. So the question is children.
Yeah, how many children? Does that play a role?
I wish I knew the answer to that question too. We have some of that data in one of our data sets that we haven't looked at yet.
Yeah, the Ross map has it. So
Rosmap happened, yeah, and the Ontario Health Study as well.
mhm.
Uh,
It's very mixed, another mixed bag
yeah, and in
in terms of
terms of
what people find
yeah, in
generally.
terms of age at menarche, I know that comes up and people look at the reproductive span, and
Mhm.
whenever I don't know, my sense is that it's more about menopause timing, but that's a biased answer. I'm going to say it's based on like a hunch more than data, and maybe because it's the data that I've seen in the studies that I've done, that I see that the impact is much greater for menopause timing than menarche timing. And I also think that like
And you're talking
that
about retrospective data too, right?
yeah, retrospective data too. And I think girls are getting their periods earlier these days, which will potentially lengthen the reproductive span. But I don't think that is necessarily representing a good or healthy thing. I actually think it might be representing toxins or something else that's impacting the hormones. And so I think if we're just looking at the reproductive span, maybe we're going to be misguided. I don't know. Again, because we don't have the data.
I know it's very difficult to answer these. And then Ingrid and somebody else was mentioning something which I would just call precision medicine, which is that individual health advice is really important. And yeah, I think we would both agree that that is absolutely what's necessary. Um, and it's going to depend on a number of factors. But let you answer that question. So, what would you say in terms of some individual health advice or precision medicine in terms of women's brain health?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to go towards precision medicine. I don't, what works for men doesn't work for everybody. And I think, again, many of us here know that. But I think it's even going to be more precise than that for each individual person. We all have our own histories, genetics, environmental exposures. And I think all of those things likely matter.
Mhm.
And,
Yeah,
and the more we know, the better, right?
yeah, the more we know,
For
the better.
precision
Yeah.
medicine.
Yeah, number one thing is, again, just mentioning Dr. Louis Ambrose's work, and in fact, she has a paper called Personalized Exercise Interventions, and to do that work, we need the data, right? We need the support to do the work so that we can give more advice on that's very, very personalized to the individual. But what would you say, sort of in general, in a podcast we recently did together? I thought I loved the way you put it in terms of, do you want
What
me
does
to?
it say?
It
Yeah, I
was
don't know.
what's good for the heart is good for the
Oh
brain.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think I think we have a lot of control over our dementia risk. Dementia is not inevitable, and um, kind of before getting into women's health, I focused a lot on vascular health. And in my work, we show that if you have amyloid in the brain and good vascular health, you really can delay cognitive decline or even maybe even prevent it. And if you have poor vascular health and amyloid in yeah, so poor vascular health and amyloid, you're going to accelerate the decline and you're going to have more tau pathology. But if you have good vascular health, you can basically prevent all of that from happening. So, and again, like we know how to treat those things. And I think we just need to take a more proactive approach. And I really think of dementia, protecting ourselves against dementia is a lifelong process. We shouldn't just start when we're at the age where maybe we're starting to think about dementia, maybe in our 60s. I think we really need to develop good habits from early on and exercise and eat well and get our blood pressure monitored, cholesterol monitored, because it really has a huge impact on our brain.
Well, thank you very much. We're at time. Somebody asked about the slides. This was recorded and it will be placed on our YouTube channel. So please do. There's lots of questions. It's great to see all this engagement. But just join me one last time in thanking Dr. Rabin for an excellent talk with lots of questions. And we'll try to answer your questions as we go through this Women's Health Seminar series. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone's attention.